Hello, in today's video we'll be working on a 93 Toyota pickup with a surging idle problem. You might say that the truck's not surging right now. Well, for that I need to explain what I did. I've gone through and done some testing looking for any potential vacuum leaks, and there were none. And I also wanted to check to make sure that the coolant was filled up to the level and circulating properly. And that checked out fine. So I ran a bypass by plugging the idle air control port. And that leaves us here where we are now, basically telling me that our problem lies with the idle air control valve. So after removing the plug for the idle air control port, you will notice how it immediately affects the idle, causing an idle surge, meaning that it revs up and down on its own. You might also wonder why I checked the coolant level. Well, this idle air control valve uses the coolant temperature to adjust the idle speed, and if it doesn't have the coolant circulating properly, the valve will not work properly. And this is our idle surge problem. You'll notice that I can adjust the idle screw all the way down and fix the idle surge. But that's only a patch, and that's not what we want. We want an actual fix. So for that we can begin removing the idle air control valve. We can start by removing this one air tube. It's held on by two clamps, which you can use pliers for, or I just use my fingers. And now for the actual air intake tube, it's held on by two clamps, which you'll need a 10mm socket for. Once you got both clamps loosened, you can just pop off the intake tube. Next we can disconnect the connector to the throttle position sensor. You'll want to press in on the tab and slide the connector off. We'll have to remove these 4 vacuum lines. I like to look for any differences in the markings to remember in which port they go to. You always want to place them back in the same spot. Taking a picture does help a lot. You may notice that I have the coolant draining. There's a petcock on the radiator you'll want to open to let it drain, since you will have to remove 2 of the coolant lines to the idle air control valve. This hose can be removed next. You'll want to press in on the clamp with your fingers as you rotate the hose off. It may be on pretty tight. And now the 2 coolant lines. You'll want to get some pliers to press in on the clamps so you can slide the clamps back, and that way we could get the hoses off. You can also press down on the clamp and pull back on the hose, so the hose and the clamp slide back together. And that's one of the coolant lines. Now for the other. You'll want to have a pan underneath to collect the coolant, since the second hose does drain a lot. Now we can remove the throttle cable. Just pull back on the throttle and slide the cable end off. Finally, we can remove the throttle body, which is held on by 3 bolts and 1 nut, which will need a 12mm socket and an extension for 3 of the 4 bolts. And here's our first bolt. The second bolt. The nut. And our last bolt. And we can finally remove the throttle body. This idle air control valve is held on by 4 screws, and these screws are on here pretty tight. I have this cool impact driver which you use a hammer on to loosen the screws. It's kind of like an impact wrench but for screws. Once you remove all 4 screws, you can carefully lift off the idle air control valve. This is the replacement idle air control valve that I'll be using, and the gasket that you will need. But before installing the new idle air control valve, you'll want to clean the throttle body port and the chambers to the idle air control valve, using throttle body cleaner. And you'll also want to clean the surface. I use a piece of gray Scotch-Brite. And finally, just wipe off any remaining residue using a towel. We're now ready to install the new idle air control valve with the new gasket. You'll want to place the gasket in the grooves. And I find it easier to bring the throttle body on top of the idle air control valve so the gasket stays in place. And we can now put the screws back in. You'll also need to replace the throttle body gasket. The first thing you want to do is make sure that the new gasket matches your old one. Once you verify that it's the same, you can remove the old gasket. This old gasket is on there pretty good. What I like to do is lubricate the surface with WD-40 so you don't scrape the throttle body surface. And use a blade angled kind of flat with the surface to remove any of the remaining old gasket. But be careful and avoid using the blade towards you. You always want to work away from you. Now that you got the old gasket removed and the surface flat, we want to go ahead and reinstall the throttle body. And don't forget that the surface on the intake has to be clean as well. You'll want to put the new gasket into position and hold it in place with 2 of the bolts. You'll want to snug them up and reinstall the remaining bolt and the nut. When tightening the throttle body bolts, you'll want to tighten them in a crisscross pattern. We can now just reinstall the remaining hoses, tubes, linkages, and accessories. You'll also want to top up the cooling system and get rid of any air pockets. As you can notice, there's definitely a big difference in the idle. It's definitely a lot lower than when we started, and that being because I was messing with the idle speed screw. I'll just have to adjust the idle back up to recommended. Thank you for watching. I hope you were able to find this video helpful. If you did, please hit that like button. It helps support my video and my channel. And subscribe if you haven't done so already.